Hosting our discussion and leading our group today is Dr. David Azrad. David serves us as the director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. Please join us in welcoming him. David?
Thank you, John. Welcome everyone to the Heritage Foundation for this panel discussion on what the next president should do to confront the administrative state. Upon taking office on January 20th, 2017, the next president will do two things. I'll use the masculine pronoun throughout. No offense to Carly Fiorina or Hillary Clinton, but it's quicker that way. First of all, he will swear an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution. And second, in the soaring rhetoric of a first inaugural address, he'll claim a mandate to implement the policies upon which he campaigned. And then, when he takes office, he'll run up against our sprawling administrative state, which will make it rather difficult for him to carry out his oath and his mandate. First, because the administrative state, which has been built up over the course of the 20th century and is now deeply entrenched, for the most part exists outside of the strictures of the Constitution and is in deep tension with its underlying principles. Second, because this administrative state is to a considerable degree insulated from his political control, and that's by design. Like all presidents, the next president will need to establish his authority over the bureaucracy, parts of which are comprised of independent regulatory agencies that are not formally housed in the executive branch of government, and the whole of which, if history is any indication, will in practice be opposed to reforming its ways. All presidents confront these problems, but the next president will face an especially urgent problem because of the unusual excesses of the past years, and I have in mind three things. First of all, Obama's executive unilateralism on a host of issues ranging from healthcare to immigration and environmental law. Second, congressional delegation run riot, most evident in the two mammoth laws that were passed by the 111th Congress, Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, both of which delegate enormous powers to agencies to craft very costly regulations. And third, judicial hyperdeference to agencies, which the current court in City of Arlington versus FCC has now extended, allowing agencies to determine not only how to interpret the laws and their organic statutes, but also their own jurisdiction. What then should the next president do to rein in the administrative state? How can he regain some control over the bureaucracy? And we don't often think of it this way, what role do Congress and the courts have to play in helping him do so? To discuss these important questions, which I really must insist go to the heart of constitutional government in America, it is my great pleasure to introduce our panel today. First up to my left will be Christopher Demuth, who is a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute. You may, of course, know that he served as president of AEI for 20 years. He's published numerous articles, essays, books on a range of issues ranging from regulatory reform to the role of religion, environmental policy. He's been on a roll recently with a series of essays calling on Congress to reassert its powers. After him will be Michael Grieva, who's a professor of law at George Mason University School of Law. He was also formerly at AEI, where he specialized in con law, the courts, and business regulation. He's the author of numerous scholarly articles and I believe 9 books, the last one being The Upside Down Constitution that was published by Harvard University Press in 2012. And he is widely recognized as one of the leading experts on federalism in the country. And then batting cleanup will be Joe Postel, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, where he teaches courses on con law, administrative law, American political institutions, and American political thought. He previously worked at the Heritage Foundation in the very shop that I now oversee. In fact, I replaced him when he departed for the greener pastures of the Academy, and he now sits on our Council of Academic Advisors. He's the editor of 2 books and is now putting the finishing touches on a book that should come out next year entitled Bureaucracy in America, the Administrative State and American Constitutionalism. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes and will then open it up to a discussion between the panelists and also involving you, the audience. Chris?
David, thank you very much. Every new president of whatever party or philosophical persuasion confronts the problem that David mentioned, that he is the nominal CEO of a vast bureaucracy, which is in fact a confederation of semi-autonomous fiefdoms. He wants to bring them to some serviceable program of cooperation with his program. My understanding is that today we are engaged in a bit of a thought experiment on a more ambitious question, and that is we're going to assume that the new president is somebody who cares about the constitutional deformations and excesses, regulatory excesses that David spoke of. This individual might be a Heritage Foundation certified conservative, but we're going to assume that he is at least a reform-minded person who wants to reverse the excesses of unaccountable regulation, presidential usurpations of legislative authority that we've seen so much of in recent years, and the wholesale delegation of lawmaking by the Congress, which has been going on for about 40 years in dramatic fashion. For such a fundamental, radical change, which will certainly involve many particular items of law, constitutional advocacy in the courts over time, I think that the key is, and also tightened procedures under which OMB and OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, reviews rules before they are launched. In addition to those things, the first steps are important, and in my remarks, I want to emphasize the, frankly, political task of taking bold initial steps. And I believe that the President will want to do this to accomplish three things at once. First, in particular areas, to advance his policy agenda. Secondly, and most important of all, to choose issues that dramatize the pathologies of the regulatory state intrinsically, not just undoing this or that Obama did, but taking on some large subjects where there is a dramatic divergence between popular opinion, common sense on the one hand, and the views of the bureaucracy and elite Washington opinion on the other. And third, in so doing, to impress the bureaucracy, executive branch wide, that this president is indeed willing to take on and defeat vested interests and large bureaucratic and issues that have a large degree of bureaucratic momentum for purposes of letting the bureaucracy know who is in charge and that this individual is a skilled political practitioner who understands their business and they better understand what his program is. One can see that the last time there was such a need for a dramatic change was when Ronald Reagan replaced Jimmy Carter in January of 1981. Carter and Nixon and Ford before him had a program of review, fairly informal program of review of agency regulations before they could be published. Reagan tightened this up dramatically. He essentially required that every rule and every rulemaking proposal could not go to the Federal Register before going to him first. His agents in OMB, the OIRA office, and he set forth a specific policy for the first time, that is, that no rule or proposal could be issued except on evidence that its benefits exceeded its costs and that the agency had chosen the alternative with the largest net benefits. This got a lot of people's attention. OIRA was well-staffed and began to exert immediate changes in the direction of regulatory policy. But he did more than that. His first day in office, he decontrolled petroleum prices. He actually had the authority to do that, unlike many things that the president has done in recent years. When somebody told him that he could just sign a document and decontrol all petroleum prices. He said, I can do that. Anybody got a pen? And he did it immediately, and it was a dramatic act. I remember Dan Rather saying that night that, this fool has come to Washington, this is going to be a catastrophe. It turned out to be wonderfully advantageous in almost immediately. And then he took advantage of the fact that the air traffic controllers thought that holding an illegal strike would be a good time right now to demonstrate who was really in charge. He fired them all. That demonstrated more than anything to the bureaucracy that this character meant business and was a great popular politician. When Bill Clinton came in, another new president at the end of the Reagan and Bush years, it was different. And with Clinton and with Obama, it's a little bit different for a liberal Democrat because they're essentially in favor of everything that the bureaucratic state has done. Not entirely, but generally. And there was a contentious debate in the White House at the beginning of the Obama administration, at the beginning of the Clinton administration, whether they were going to continue these free market regulatory reform policies of the Reagan and Bush years conducted under the executive order. And there was a huge battle royal that the president came in and settled himself. He said, yes, we're going to continue that. Anybody wants to issue a rule, they've got to come to the White House first. And he exercised that power just as vigorously as Ronald Reagan did, although on behalf of more regulation rather than, in general, more regulation rather than less. Although he did a president is going to have a different view than the bureaucracy, even in a Democratic administration. Obama was a little bit different. President Bush had really set the table for Obama with some bold unilateral extra statutory moves in the months following the financial crisis. He had taken the TARP legislation and used it completely against the statute to bail out two major automobile companies. He said, I'm doing this to preserve the options of my successor because he may want to do something and I don't want to do anything that interferes with his prerogatives. And Obama essentially took all of these new practices and put them on steroids and continued in very aggressive fashion the unilateralist steps that President Bush had begun. He made some changes in inherited Bush programs. He de-emphasized the faith-based initiatives regulations. Most of all, he appointed numerous czars, essentially moving policy authority from the bureaucracy into the White House in environmental and financial regulation and other matters, greatly centralizing authority in the White House beyond anything that Reagan, Bush, Clinton, or Bush had done. So I think that our man coming in a year from January is going to want to do things more like Reagan. In addition to tightening up procedures, and I think that Joe may be speaking about some of those matters, he wants to look for some immediate actions to take. I want to suggest four very quickly. One, the most obvious thing, the equivalent of Reagan's oil price decontrol, will be to approve the Keystone Pipeline his first day in office. And I believe that the candidate, once the general election gets underway, because we know that the Democratic candidate is opposed to the Keystone Pipeline, should announce that it is his intention to do that. He will be doing it as president, not a candidate. He has certain, he has to take into account things. There's a statute that says what he should consider, but these are very general matters. This is an issue that has been briefed for 8 or 9 years, and Obama, even though the issue is now moot because the proposal has been withdrawn, he said, well, he's going to decide it anyway. So there will be an elaborate record, but it is one where this is really the president's call, and he can make that on the first day. And I think doing something like that, that Washington will regard as, there'll be a flurry of excitement about how controversial and risky this will be. I think that would be a good step. Secondly, I think he should immediately take steps to remove the highly perverse imposition of full federal regulation over the Internet. President Obama actually did our new president a favor because he implicitly took on the view that David summarized, that the independent agencies are actually part of some other government. They're not really accountable to the president. Presidents have always intervened in independent regulatory commissions when they cared about it. President Obama changed things by doing it publicly. He even made a video and announced what he thought that the FCC should do, which they promptly did. I think that the new president should announce what he thinks that they should do, which is to entirely withdraw those regulations. And as soon as he gets 3 members of the commission to ask them to do it. At the same time, he should reverse the president's decision, which has now been delayed, to withdraw America's supervision of ICON, which ensures a global free internet by control of the root addresses against the designs of countries like Russia and China, to internationalize the sorts of controls that they maintain domestically. So a free, open, progressive, innovative internet would be something that he could take large strides toward in his first week. Third, financial regulation. Undoing the dangers of Dodd-Frank will take time, but those dangers are real. We have resurrected Fannie and Freddie, which are pestilential forces in American finance. The Financial Stability Oversight Council is busy designating many formerly private large banks as additional government-sponsored enterprises, which are implicitly, whose debts are implicitly guaranteed against failure. But the president can do something immediately through his top executives, which is to announce that we are going to be expecting much higher capital standards of all banks, especially major banks, so that nobody will even come close to having to come with their tin cup to the taxpayer if there is another major financial crisis. This will have the advantage that Goldman Sachs and Citigroup and J.P. Morgan will go ballistic and attack this, so that this will be a nice sort of a populist move for the new president. There is support in both parties of Congress for such a move, and abundant intellectual support from it. Once it gets in place, it will start to dawn on people that because the banks now are essentially capitalized enough to withstand a major financial hiccup, that the procedures of Dodd-Frank with their micromanagement of large banks are essentially unnecessary, and that will lay the groundwork for undoing that. I think I just have a minute or two left. Is that true, David? So I'm just going to say two final things. My fourth immediate initiative concerns what I would call grievance regulation. This is not economic matters or environmental matters such as I have mentioned, and I'm particularly concerned at the efforts. I'm concerned with the efforts of the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education going back many, many decades. But the excesses of this office operating through Dear Colleague letters to set up essentially parallel enforcement machineries on on virtually all college campuses, and setting up new tribunals with easy standards of conviction for cases of he said, she said, sexual assault or abuse. Their most recent efforts to revolutionize state financing of secondary education. All of these things are major revolutionary changes. They've had big effects on secondary and college, university campuses. They're without any good warrant in statutory law. They've not followed any administrative procedures. They can be undone immediately. This would be considered radically controversial in Washington, but if you talk to academics of all political persuasions on the campuses, the abuses that OCR has wrought are tremendous, and I believe the change beyond Washington would be highly welcome. I want to say one final thing before passing the baton over to Mike Grieva. And that is that, well, we will be talking about that I think that the problem of Congress's escaping accountability for policies such as these is a deep and systematic one. The Congress has been talking about things such as the REINS Act, where major regulations would have to be reviewed and approved by both houses of Congress under expedited procedures similar to those in base closing and trade liberalization exercises. I've been talking about it for a long time. It's controversial, it's complex, and one reason that Congress doesn't want it, even though it's now all Republican, is that if they do that, they're actually going to have to make decisions on some very costly and controversial matters that they would rather leave to the executive branch. I think that the new president should let it be known immediately that we need to develop new procedures between the executive and the legislature for shared political accountability for major regulatory decisions. He doesn't have to go, all the way to a REINS statute. He could take selected major rulemaking revisions and announce to Congress that they're going to go through rulemaking, but when they're done, they're going to send the whole thing up to Congress and ask them to pass it and announce that they are not going to issue these rules until and unless Congress, they are approved by majorities of both houses of Congress. Substantial revisions to the EPA clean energy proposal, which has deep policy problems as well as statutory and constitutional problems. Revisions to energy efficiency standards, especially for automobiles, which, as the Volkswagen scandal illustrates, regardless of what we may find about what actually was going on inside Volkswagen, we are imposing on automobile manufacturers impossibly conflicting demands for emissions, fuel economy, other sorts of standards. This needs to be substantially revised. That would be a major change in policy. I don't think it should be done by, it can be done by rulemaking substantially. I think that Congress should be in on the act, and I think in those two cases and many others, the new president should take the proposals that he's worked through with his appointees and send them up to Congress and ask them to approve them. Thank you.
Michael?
I won't take my 10 minutes. I just have a few footnotes to what Chris just said. The basic idea was to do, or one of the many basic ideas was do something big and do it fast and do it promptly. There are, in fact, candidates out there who have said the same thing and proposed the same thing. So, for example, Jeb Bush had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a while ago. That's what I want to do. And I should say I'm not speaking for Jeb Bush in any capacity, and I'm not propounding his campaign or promoting his campaign. It's just by way of example that these ideas are out there. He even came up with the same list, or a very similar list to the one Chris mentioned. So net neutrality is on that list. The EPA's Clean Power Plan is on that list. The EPA's Clean Water Rule is on that list. The coal ash rule that the EPA is considering, I'm sure, before the year is out, or another full year is out, there'll be other ideas to consider. I just want to, by way of footnote, add that while this looks like, hurrah, it's a deregulatory agenda and the entire conservative movement, or whatever you want to call it, ought to get behind it, it is distressing to see that most of these proposed programs already have built up huge and entrenched constituencies, business constituencies in their favor. So nobody who goes into this arena should fool himself or herself that this will be easy and will have an easily unifying effect. You really have to face down some very powerful people along with the usual suspects. If you look at the comments at the online comments to Governor Bush's op-ed, along with the usual suspects who scream that this is a right-wing agenda, there are lots of people who say this is not remotely enough. We have to face down the entire beast. Yeah, I'm in favor of that too, but I think the basic program is right to focus on something that's big and immediate, as opposed to things that are more long-term and require legislation, and as opposed to or distinct from managerial reforms that aim to make the system better and to bring more unifying force to this. Again, I'm not against these things, but it's important to do something immediately. There are reasons for that in addition to the ones Chris mentioned, I think. The first thing is that if you look at structural reforms or managerial reforms, invariably, especially in the early days of a presidency, that's sort of inside baseball. You have to delegate it way down to third level people because the adults early on are extremely busy. And when that happens, it's sort of easily hijacked. I remember one episode from the early days of the Bush administration, W administration. The president had this great idea of we have to promote federalism. And this was delegated to some people at the Department of Justice, and their brilliant idea was we should make it much harder for agencies to preempt states. And the next thing you know is the entire Chamber of Commerce goes into full battle mode. And then they call me because they say, Grieva, these are your friends, make them listen. Tried, and the entire thing ends with a bloodbath because somebody from General Motors or the chamber or whatever had to call the White House and ask Andy Card to kindly stop these kids. And so nothing ever came of it, and then everybody got preoccupied with 9/11. But there was a lot of blood on the floor before they even started. The second thing is that these things, I mean, stuff that looks pretty good on paper and ought to work is often ineffectual. So we had a conference, one of these transatlantic conferences a few weeks ago, and one of our friends, Alberto Mingardi, who's from Italy, gave this very funny and interesting talk, I thought. He said, you think you have a dysfunctional government, you have nothing on us. I'm from Italy. And there were these constant proposals to do something about inefficient and counterproductive constitutional arrangements. And since it's much easier there to change the Constitution than it is here, people actually did that. He had a long, long list of 40 constitutional reforms or whatever the number was that had been actually implemented over the years and had not made a damn bit of difference. This is often true of things that are meant to make government work better. They're frequently ineffectual and get lost. I don't think a lot of the stuff that we've heaped on the APA over the years has made things any better. The third thing is that I sort of share everyone's concern about constitutional government and the rule of law, but I think for real people you have to connect those values to something that is in fact real. And that means you have to seize on something that they can see and that makes a real difference in the economy, ideally. And I think the big things like net neutrality, the Clean Power Plan, those sorts of things would in fact accomplish that, among other things, because they would restore some confidence in important sectors of the economy. And that's one of the things that we have sort of lost over the years. There is no effective way for government anymore to pre-commit to not doing something stupid. And if you can to figure out a way to make that commitment credible again by saying we are not going to do that, period, that might be a sensible way to go about things. And the final thing I'd say is Chris has written eloquently and extensively about the decline of Congress, and that being the problem rather than the imperial presidency per se. I think in the long term, if you want to do something about that, you have to incentivize Democrats somehow, that this is a problem for them as well. So far, the imperial presidency has gone only one way. That's their time horizon. Their model of government has no Republicans in it, at least no Republican president. And if you want to change that calculus, you have to do something dramatic, something that really hurts them and makes them sit up and say, well, maybe this cuts both ways, and maybe the other side has something important here to say.
Joe?
Well, thank you, David. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation for having me here. I'm going to focus a little less on policy reversals and policy changes and a little more on what I see as a problem of separation of powers and checks and balances, and how maybe we can start to think about restructuring checks and balances so that they actually work to constrain administrative behavior. So, the administrative state has been around for 100 years, but I think today more than ever we have a really good understanding of how it works, and we have some really interesting ideas for how to fix it or how to reform it. The problem is that the administrative state, I think as has already been mentioned, is very capable of responding to reforms. So when you fix one thing, it channels administrative decision-making a different way. And so this requires sort of vigilance and constant creative thinking to keep up with the administrative state. So in some way, we fight one battle and they're already fighting the next one, and we have to catch up. Some of the things I want to advocate might help us to anticipate next moves as well as the existing moves we have to make. So my focus will be on using the power of judicial review and heightening the power of judicial review and the scope of judicial review to introduce judicial checks on administrative decision-making. I should say the last thing Christopher mentioned, which is why not have the president send major proposals and major rules, not designated as the $100 million a year threshold, but really major rules, over to Congress and have them be enacted, would actually render everything I'm about to say superfluous and perhaps even dangerous or unnecessary. If the elected representatives are making these decisions and enacting these regulations themselves, you don't need heightened judicial review. You have a much better solution. But assuming that doesn't work out, these are some of the things I'd like to see. The first big proposal, and I'll spend most of my time talking about this, is to revise the Administrative Procedure Act to specify that courts should review agencies' interpretations of law de novo and not deferentially. This would be ending the so-called Chevron doctrine, which says that any time a statute is ambiguous, courts will defer to any reasonable agency interpretation of the law. The basic problem here is that Chevron's rationale it doesn't fit with our system of constitutional government. The job of the courts is to interpret the law, not to defer to agencies who are interpreting the law, and this is actually their peculiar expertise. This is what courts are good at doing. And more fundamentally, when agencies get deference from courts when they're reviewing or interpreting law, this creates the very conflicts of interest that the Constitution is designed to prevent. If agencies get deference on statutory interpretation, on their interpretation of statutory requirements, and even on interpretations of their own rules, which has come up recently, then there's nothing to counteract the ambition of administrators. And that's one of the basic purposes of our constitutional system. I think even defenders of judicial deference are starting to see this problem. I'm thinking especially of Justice Scalia's concurring opinion in the Perez versus Mortgage Bankers case, where he sort of suggests that deference creates all of these perverse incentives and all of these problems. So I think the time is ripe for revisiting this. There are two foundations I think you find for the Chevron doctrine that are advanced, and both of them I think are wrong. The first argument for Chevron is that it advances political accountability. In the words of the Chevron opinion, this is quoting from Chevron, "While agencies are not directly accountable to the people, the chief executive is, and it is entirely appropriate for this political branch of government to make policy choices." End of quote. Now that implies that the agencies are somehow accountable to the chief executive in some meaningful way, so that the agencies are accountable to the people. That assumption, I think, is highly questionable. And so I don't think that Chevron deference somehow advances or promotes the political accountability of the administrative state. Therefore, I think that argument is deeply problematic. The legal argument in favor of Chevron is this. Back in the 19th century, under these things called writs of mandamus, courts granted deference to executive interpretations of law. Writs of mandamus are used to enforce action from an administrator when the law does not grant them discretion. In these cases, the action is a purely ministerial action. There's no discretion for the administrator. Therefore, the courts can force that person to act in accordance with the law. In a series of cases in the 19th century, the courts shifted from de novo review of statutes in this context to deferential interpretation. The chief architect of this doctrinal shift was Roger Taney, a Jacksonian, a devout Jacksonian, therefore a staunch advocate of judicial restraint to executive power. And so Chevron, in its legal origins, actually finds a significant defender in Taney, which I think is a very telling fact which needs to be pointed out more frequently. However, even Taney, who sort of established judicial deference to executive actors in mandamus cases, also said that in other cases, outside of that context, de novo review of executive action was required, so things like common law actions. So there really is a very weak historical origin or foundation for Chevron. More importantly than all of that, though, is that the Administrative Procedure Act, passed in 1946, was designed to restore judicial review in the face of progressive and New Deal reformers who really didn't want the courts to review administrative action. So progressives and New Dealers gradually, by collapsing distinctions in administrative law that allowed for judicial review of agencies, set up this regime of deference during the New Deal period. The Administrative Procedure Act was designed to reverse those trends and restore judicial review. One of the provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act, Section 706, says, and I'm quoting, "A reviewing court shall decide all relevant questions of law and interpret constitutional and statutory provisions." End of the quote. Now, that's pretty straightforward. A reviewing court shall decide all relevant questions of law and interpret constitutional and statutory provisions. The aim of that provision was, I think the evidence suggests, the legislative history suggests, to get the courts back in to reviewing these agencies instead of deferring to them. The problem is that this language has been largely or wholly ignored by judges. So the regime of deference that the progressives and the New Dealers set up has survived the APA and has even been invigorated in recent decades. Recent cases, though, Perez versus Mortgage Bankers, City of Arlington versus FCC, those decisions start to reveal the cracks in this whole edifice of deference, and so I think it's appropriate to question the whole thing. I think I could leave this to the lawyers to come up with a more specific plan, but one way to do this would be to revise the APA to simply say, when reviewing questions involving agencies' legal interpretations, the courts will review those things de novo, granting no deference to the agencies. This would leave the agencies with deference on fact-finding when they find certain facts, but it would provide for de novo review of legal interpretations. I have two other proposals that I'll talk about much more briefly. The second proposal would be, at the same time, to expand what is known today as arbitrary and capricious review. So another part of the APA says agencies' actions should be set aside by a court when they are arbitrary, capricious, an abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with law. This standard has been applied very deferentially by courts to require a hard look, some explanation, but not much more than that. The APA could also be modified at the same time that we fix the Chevron problem to say that agencies have to demonstrate a sort of cost-benefit analysis that has been undertaken and that has been survived in order to pass judicial review under this standard. Those kinds of reforms would heighten judicial scrutiny of administrative action. My third proposal would do something a little different, also involving the courts, and that is to bring back personal liability for administrative officers. So in the early days of the American Republic, this is a fascinating history. When administrators violated the law, they could be brought into court and held personally liable for damages under common law actions like trespass or other sorts of things. Some statutes even provided for this sort of action. Things like if officers like inspections officials did not follow statutory responsibilities. These penalties were mostly used in revenue collection, although there's some really interesting ones in the post office as well. Post officers were often threatened with capital punishment if they violated statutory responsibilities. I'm not willing to go that far. But in the revenue collection context, it's really interesting. These officers are writing to Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, saying, you know, I don't know whether the law authorizes me to take this action, so I need your sanction as the head of the department to carry this out. And the exchanges are very fascinating, but they illustrate a basic point, which is when you threaten administrative officers with personal liability enforced by independent courts, this goes a long way in constraining individual administrative decision-making. Back then, they would only act if they were certain that the law stood on their side and that they could use it as a defense in a court. Otherwise, they risked their own personal liability for things like trespass, damages, and so forth. Today, restoring officer liability might make some administrative officers think twice before issuing things like guidance documents or enforcement letters where they're not certain whether they're going to end up having to defend their position in a court of law and be personally on the line for that decision. That's a third possibility. The combination of these efforts, I would argue, would constrain the administrative state by putting legal checks on administrative action through the courts. When interpreting statutes, making decisions, issuing guidance documents, agencies would know that the judiciary stands there ready as a sort of check on their decisions. And they might be more reluctant to push their powers to the very edges of the law. If broad delegation of power to the administrative state is here to stay, then I think this makes a lot of sense as a second best option for restoring checks and balances.
Thank you. Before we open it up for questions from the floor, do any of you care to respond to something that one of the other panelists has said, or are you all in heated agreement?
Could I say a quick word?
Sure.
Based on both of those very interesting presentations? I think that even if we found some procedures, such as my proposal to begin experimenting with range-like procedures, to get Congress to take more authority, there's no time soon that we're going to have a Congress that does everything in place of the administrative state. We're not going to have a Philip Hamburger revolution. It simply cannot be done in the situation that we are in, which is we have this vast administrative apparatus downtown, and Congress still has, it's still 535 people, and it's a very cumbersome bunch of procedures. They simply cannot keep up. For the foreseeable future, the job of effective day-to-day, the restoration of day-to-day checking and balancing is going to be up to the courts. So I think that what Joe has recommended, I think that those are all excellent ideas. The president can help out with a lot of them by the way the executive branch advocates for particular rules. Right now, the cost-benefit analyses that are done for major rules for essentially for most executive branch regulations, a lot of times they don't even go in the rulemaking record. One little change was to insist that they be put into the rulemaking record, and the advocacy of pro and con of regulation in court then changes fundamentally, and in effect arbitrary and capricious. I mean, if people can show that something has costs 2 orders of magnitude bigger than the benefits, which is not unusual these days, it sounds pretty arbitrary to me. Secondly, both Mike and Joe mentioned the dilemma of changing procedures and what the effects are, and that there are huge political interests that are now behind and reinforce the administrative state, including business interests. And it just seems to go on no matter what anybody else does. I just want to remark on the fact, which I believe that this is true. I think that it is the natural progression for Congress to give up more lawmaking authority. They figured out other means to get reelected, and for business interests to collaborate with and make their peace with the regulatory agencies. The only way we break out of this is through presidential leadership. I don't see anything else in our constitutional system. The courts have not just been stupid in doing these things that Joe decries. They have been reacting to pressures. Congress has been reacting to political pressures. And the president in his early days has to realize he's not just an advocate for executive power. And it's a difficult thing to do because we do have this competitive system. And if you're sitting in the White House, you see the Congress and you see the courts do stupid things every day. And it's just infuriating. And if you could just do things yourself, we could really set things straight. And it's going to require, to get out of the morass we're in, an individual in the Oval Office who has a larger vision of things and can understand the interests of the good health of the constitutional order as going beyond his exercise of his prerogatives while he's there.
If there are any questions from the audience, can you just wait for the mic to arrive? Zach, I think there's one in front. Zach, this gentleman right here.
I'm going to reveal my political naivete with this question, but I'd like a simpler approach. And I remember back in the early days that Reagan had a very mild RIF program, reduction in force, where he just let some federal employees go. And it seems to me that if these agencies had a lot fewer people and a lot less money, that they would be able to do less harm. So if you reduce their budgets and reduce their personnel by, let's say, 20% or something like that, I don't know if the executive can do that or not. It seems to me that they can do less destructive stuff. I would start with their SWAT teams, but then I would go on from there. That's a straightforward, direct approach, and I don't know if it's realistic or not. That's why I'm wondering if I'm being overly naive.
I'm skeptical for largely empirical reasons. It turns out that the focus on reducing the size of the federal government, too many damn federal bureaucrats, induces contracting out and kicking things over into state and local governments, and that's what happened over time. In fact, so you end up with this shadow federal government that is vastly larger than anybody imagines. John DiIulio has written very well about this, and it's a horror show. In a lot of ways, it's more honest to say, look, let's at least pay for the government that we want and put these people on the federal payroll if that's the system that we want to have.
Michael, there was an article in the last issue of National Affairs taking the opposite approach, saying we should grow government, namely Congress, that it's understaffed, underfunded, that they need more employees to check. What do you think of that idea?
I don't know what the numbers are, but Congress has, 35,000 aides? I mean, how many more do you need? I think it's largely a function of, or a question of, what do you actually want these people to do? And so long as their basic job is to gin up more ideas for their congressmen to do dumb things, I'd say reduce their force. If it's something more sensible, I'll say, give them more things to do or increase the size of that sector as might be needed. But I think the larger problem there is what they do, not what the numbers or their capacity is.
Jacob in the back.
Has the kind of person who goes into the federal bureaucracy changed over time? Is there a person with a different sort of ambition today than there would have been in these agencies decades ago? And does that in any way relate to the expansion of their efforts and ambitions?
I don't have anything more than an impressionistic opinion on the point. I think that it has changed, and not for the better, because the conditions of employment in the bureaucracy have become much more adverse and difficult. I think that there are some areas. I think in the military, to some extent, the Foreign Service attracts very bright and ambitious people, and I think that you can find good people in the agencies. When I've been in government, it's just amazing the intelligent people you come across. But I think that if we go back to the days of the Forest Service, Frank Fukuyama loves the Forest Service of the teens and so forth. I think that you would find I think that if you compared the Forest Service of the teens with the National Park Service today, you'd find a lot more ideology, kind of abstract ideology of people attached to larger ideas about society, and they're going to use this agency to further a crusade rather than simply trying to accomplish the practical goals of the Park or Forest Service. So I think that it's changed, but I couldn't push it any further than that.
So, in discussing Chevron and its progeny, one thing that strikes me is that the environment that begot Chevron was not a bunch of lefty activist judges. It was, shall we say, our own people on the D.C. Circuit in the mid-'80s who saw a situation, I hate to accuse them of outcome-oriented jurisprudence, but when we had a situation where we had a conservative administration pushing a deregulatory agenda that ran into something of a brick wall in a D.C. Circuit packed with some pretty far left appointees who saw it as their job to write 100-plus page long opinions and essentially redo the entire administrative process from the judiciary. And it certainly strikes me that come 2017, should we have a good outcome of this election, that we might be facing something of a very similar situation. Now, I'm personally would consider myself no fan of Chevron, but what steps can we take to mitigate the problem of ending up right back in the situation that begot Chevron?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So basically, there's an argument out there, I think with a lot of validity, that the Chevron doctrine starts in the mid-'80s as a response to judicial overreach of the 70s, especially on the D.C. Circuit, where they're basically expanding what's in the APA to give them a lot of control over what the administrative agencies are doing, because the agencies are now captured by conservative presidents and organized interests. And so the idea there was the configuration was liberal judges oversee the administrative state to prevent conservative bureaucrats or the conservatives who supervise those bureaucrats from making the agency stray from their mission. And so that background, I think, does play a large role in what gives rise to deference. And so the question is, are we facing that sort of configuration again? I guess I would say two things in response to that. The first is, I'm probably not of the same mind as a lot of people who've written about this, but I'm not so sure Chevron has actually worked to establish deference. Now, I think in most cases, Chevron is sort of invoked and deference occurs, but if you look at a litany of really high-profile cases over the past 10 years, we're carving out exception after exception to Chevron, and when there are big cases, Chevron doesn't even seem to get much of a mention. King v. Burwell might be one example here, Brown and Williamson being the other very obvious one. And so it seems to me that Chevron doesn't really matter to judges who don't care about the doctrine and just want to impose their reading of a statute on the agencies. And so it only works one way, right? It only constrains those who take it seriously. And if that's the case, then why not get rid of it altogether and let both sides play according to the same game? The second thing I guess I might say is, if you're thinking of the long game as opposed to the immediate configurations, I'd much rather side with the judges than the bureaucrats, because by definition, the bureaucrats are going to look at these things a certain way, and it's not by definition that judges will look at it the same way. It's only based on a particular set of judges at a particular moment in time. So I think those would be the two things I would say in response to that. Yeah.
The gentleman in the back.
Hamburger was mentioned, and he had an article in Primus which kind of summarized a lot of this stuff. And he implied that while it can be solved at any of the stages, it starts with Congress leaving too much leeway in statements like the secretary shall determine. And if that were spelled out more completely, perhaps we would have guidelines that all the other roles can be more strictly constructed and have guidelines for constructing those. What do you think is his premise that it could be solved at any of the levels by proper determination of the roles of judicial, legislative, and executive?
Sorry, we both have tolerably firm views on this.
We're both going to speak for a half hour on the subject.
Yes, I'll just say a few words about it and then leave the rest to Chris. One of the things that I would note is that the model of New Deal legislation was big delegation, right? You sort out what's in the public interest. Go. With respect to those kinds of statutes, Professor Hamburger's prescription, up to a point, I would say, is quite persuasive. I do not believe that Congress is going to, issue licenses for drugs at the Food and Drug Administration or anything like that. But up to a point, you can see why you'd want a little more guidance and legal specificity. If you look at modern statutes, they have a very different structure. They run thousands of pages. They're very highly prescriptive, right? But then everybody knows at the front end, you can't really sort of make a bureaucracy administer that statute. I mean, the whole thing would come crashing down, and so Congress writes waiver provisions into these statutes and says, if you, the executive, want to waive X, Y, and Z, be our guest. If you want to negotiate with state and local governments over the conditions, be our guest, right? So at that level, the attempt to write highly prescriptive statutes has proven self-defeating. It's proven equally self-defeating in an earlier generation of statutes, like environmental statutes, which say the agency must do X by date Y, fishable and swimmable waters by 1975. We've kind of missed that, right? There's a limit to the capacity of Congress to constrain and steer this beast at the front end, I think, and that is true regardless of the forms of law that you might want to choose.
Hadley?
It's the old line, when a wise man is silent on things that other people think are important, he gives us to understand it's not that important after all. So you said nothing about privatization, one way of dealing with this, but do I gather from your comments that you think privatization really would be unavailing, that you'd simply create an adjunct administration along in anything you sell off?
It depends.
What do you mean by privatization?
Yeah.
Do you mean deregulation, or do you mean
No, not
turning over
deregulation.
EPA?
Private prisons, that sort of thing?
Yeah, like private mail services and other things. I had a former student who was president of El Salvador, had to deal with corruption by just selling off parts of the government. Just get them out of the government altogether.
We can privatize the phone company.
Russia privatized things by giving it to their cronies. it all depends on the terms on which you do these things.
Of course. But, you know, we had this with, of course, with the
Yeah,
national.
look,
Yeah.
Hadley, here's the serious answer.
No,
I do not believe, on the whole, that we have a problem with things that are owned by the government and there's too much of it. Yes, can you sell some public parks or, you know, whatever, or privatize those? Be my guest, I'm in favor of it. The vastly larger problem out there is that we have industry sector after industry sector after industry sector that is nominally private, but really just an appendix to the government. And I would start with the financial sector, and I would go to large segments of the energy industry and take it from there. And the healthcare, health insurance, all of that is sort of de facto government. And that form of sort of galloping corporatism is a much bigger worry, I think, than, you know, is there some park in Minnesota that we can privatize?
Jeremy, you'll get to ask the last question.
Uh-oh. He's going to blow the whole thing up.
This was all wrong.
No. It's maybe a different version of Hadley's question. I've been struck at how patient Congress and the public is with agencies that perform just horrendously badly. There's no policy dispute about the Secret Service. Everyone thinks they should keep the president safe, and then we have a succession of, you know, drunkards, tourists, crazy people just climb over the White House gates. Everyone thinks veterans should get reasonably good care, or at least within a reasonably short time at the VA, and there's just all these scandals in which managers actually have distorted and lied about what the records are. There's just a whole series of these. And first of all, I'd like the panel to say whether they share my impression that this actually is a change, that the government is becoming both more incompetent and more corrupt. The website at HHS is another example. Whether you liked it or not, the Affordable Care Act, everyone was in favor of having a functional website, and somehow they couldn't do that. And people weren't fired, and it was, you know, there was some controversy, but people weren't outraged. So first, whether you share my sense that our expectations are getting lower and lower, and second, whether you think there is anything that could be done about this other than saying the government is not able to operate hospitals, it's not able to operate websites, and actually it should contract out protection for the president because it can't even do security. And if you do believe that, what's your substitute for the Marines and the Navy?
Yeah, can I say, your puzzle is, I want to associate myself with what you said. I think it is it's something of a baffling puzzle, and a general way to think about it is this: if you think that one reason to avoid concentration of power, such as we have accomplished in recent decades, and especially the last decade, concentrations of power in the executive branch, and a sort of a much feebler congressional branch, one of the reasons you should oppose it is abuse and corruption. Okay, that Lord Acton taught us that a long time ago, and I can see a lot of what seems to me to be corruption of the sort that would have been a scandal and that would have attracted very, very sharp congressional responses in the past at the IRS, the veterans hospitals, the Secret Service, and so forth. Part of it could simply be that the president has a strong enough party. Well, his party's in a minority. The Senate is simply the Senate's not a majority rule body anymore. So essentially, Congress can't do anything, even if there are scandals. But it has impressed me how people don't really seem to care. And I think maybe they just think that they delegated the policing of scandal to the Congress. But there are big things afoot, and I don't really. This is not a scandal, but I'll tell you one thing on my item. because I'm interested in environmental law, and I think that environmental regulation is actually serious policy, unlike a lot of the things the federal bureaucracies do. The Environmental Protection Agency has become a propaganda organ. If you go to the EPA website on things, actually, somebody in the public might want to know what is the relationship of ozone to health, and what progress have we made, and are there still problems left, or fine matter, particulate, there's all this environment. You can't find out anything, because, there's a lot of research on these matters, but EPA converts them into, you'd think you were dealing with a salesman for mouthwash in a world where there was no FDA to police false claims. They say things that are wrong all the time, and that people that actually work in the environmental field know are wrong. Now, I don't know that Nixon or Reagan, that they were completely innocent of those things, but there's been a fundamental change, and we are right. We're right about this. They have blogs. Anybody that raises any question, they get squished like a grape. They just, it's just this juggernaut. And these are actually pretty complicated matters, and the effort to portray them as good versus evil and right versus wrong, it's a change in the style of government.
They have lost professionalism.
What?
They have lost professionalism.
They've lost their professionalism, and I think that restoring a degree of professionalism is important. And since we're talking about the new president, I say the new president should do that too. And that's a great thing about a new president coming in, is we can just fill him up with all of our angsts and anxieties. But he'll make some mistakes, and he won't correct things. And there are some systemic problems, and I think I agree with you.
That's a good note to end on, because the next panel we'll be doing at a date to be determined will be on civil service reform. So if you're interested in it, you can join us.
Good.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insightful. Thank you.